"Don't let him through. He knows something is wrong," a nurse whispered, but it was already too late as Captain Ethan Miller staggered through the automatic yard doors, his right hand gripping a worn duffel bag like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to this world, his breathing uneven, heavy with exhaustion that no hospital light could fully reveal, and right beside him walked Rex, a German shepherd with a steady, unreadable gaze that had seen too many battlefields to ever be fooled by. Fluorescent calm. The moment they crossed the threshold, something in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the building itself had sensed an intrusion it couldn't yet name, and Ethan, once a decorated Navy SEAL, now moved like a man carrying invisible weight in every step, his voice barely rising above a whisper as he repeated, "Can you help me? I think I'm running out of time." The triage nurse rushed forward, but Rex suddenly stopped, planting himself directly in front of Ethan, blocking him from advancing another inch, his body rigid, ears angled forward, eyes locked on every movement inside the ER, as if calculating threats no human could see. Confusion spread across the staff's faces, because nothing about this moment made sense. Not the way the dog refused to let anyone approach, not the way it tracked the hallway with silent intensity, and not the way Ethan's hand trembled as he tried to calm him with a weak gesture. A doctor stepped closer, speaking softly, but Rex responded with a low warning growl that wasn't loud, yet carried a certainty that made everyone pause. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning slightly against the wall as if the effort of standing had finally caught up to him, and in that brief silence, the monitor lights flickered, casting fractured reflections across sterile surfaces. Something about the room changed again, this time more sharply, when a man in scrubs appeared at the far end of the corridor, holding a clipboard, moving with practiced urgency. Yet Rex's entire posture shifted the moment he saw him, as if recognition had struck deeper than instinct. The dog didn't bark at the other staff, didn't react to the chaos, only this one man, and that focus felt heavier than fear, heavier than confusion, like memory itself had taken form in muscle and breath. Ethan noticed it too, his eyes narrowing slightly, though he said nothing, only watching as Rex slowly stepped forward, placing himself fully between Ethan and the corridor, refusing to yield even as hospital staff began to speak in confused tones, trying to restore order to a situation that no longer followed any sense of normalcy. The man in scrubs paused briefly, adjusting his mask, his eyes briefly meeting the dog's gaze. And in that instant, something unspoken passed through the room, something that made Rex's stance tighten even further, as if the truth had just brushed the surface but had not yet fully revealed itself. Ethan swallowed hard, a faint memory stirring behind his tired expression, something tied not to pain alone, but to a place far from this hospital, a place where trust had once been broken in silence. And now, standing in this sterile light, he realized that whatever Rex was sensing wasn't random at all. It was recognition, precise and absolute, and whatever had brought them here was no longer just about survival, but about something that had been waiting a long time to come back into the light. The silence inside the emergency room felt heavier after Rex refused to move, his stance still locked like a statue carved from instinct and memory, while Ethan Miller remained leaning against the cold wall, eyes half focused on the flickering lights above, as if trying to convince his body to stay conscious a little longer. A nurse approached cautiously, lowering her voice as she glanced between the injured former Navy SEAL and the German shepherd guarding him with unwavering attention, and she asked again if the dog could be moved, but no one seemed willing to take the first step forward anymore. Ethan slowly slid down a few inches until he was sitting, one hand still gripping the worn duffel bag, his breathing uneven but controlled, trained discipline still lingering in his posture despite exhaustion, and he muttered that Rex had never acted like this before, not without reason, not without something real behind it. The man in scrubs, at the far end of the corridor, resumed walking, clipboard held close, his steps steady and professional. Yet Rex tracked every inch of movement without blinking, his ears twitching slightly, as if decoding something invisible beneath the surface of normal behavior. A second doctor passed by, trying to redirect attention back to Ethan's condition, but Rex shifted immediately, placing himself even more firmly between Ethan and the corridor, blocking not just physical access but the flow of attention itself. forcing the entire room to remain aware of the unseen tension building in the background. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, and in that silence fragments of memory began to surface, not clear enough to fully form, but sharp enough to disturb him. Images of desert heat, static radios, and a mission that ended without proper answers, though he refused to speak of it out loud. The monitors beside him beeped steadily, each sound marking time that felt slower than it should, while the staff exchanged uncertain glances, because nothing in Ethan's current condition matched the calm precision expected from a man who once operated in the most controlled environments imaginable. Rex suddenly shifted his weight again, stepping forward half a pace, not aggressive, but decisive, and his gaze locked directly onto the man in scrubs who had now stopped near the central workstation, pretending to review charts while clearly aware of being watched. For a brief second, the man looked up, and the exchange was silent but precise, like two systems recognizing each other without permission, and Rex responded with a low, controlled sound that made one of the nurses step back instinctively. Ethan opened his eyes again at that exact moment, noticing the reaction in the room, noticing how quickly uncertainty had replaced routine, and he slowly turned his head toward the corridor, his expression tightening slightly, as if something buried deep in his past had just brushed against the present. The man in scrubs adjusted his mask again and continued moving, but now his pace felt slightly altered, less natural, and Rex followed that change with unwavering attention, never breaking focus, never relaxing even for a second, as if the entire truth of the situation depended on him not looking away. Ethan's grip on the duffel bag loosened slightly, his fingers trembling for the first time not from pain alone, but from recognition that he could not yet fully explain, and in that fragile space between memory and reality, he understood that whatever Rex was reacting to was not random hospital tension, but something tied directly to the life he thought he had left behind. The tension inside the emergency room had shifted into something quieter but far more focused, as if every sound now carried meaning, from the distant beeping of monitors to the soft shuffle of shoes across polished floors, while Ethan Miller remained seated against the wall, his breathing slowly stabilizing but his awareness growing sharper with each passing second. Rex had not moved from his position, and that alone was beginning to change the behavior of everyone in the room, because even those who did not understand why a German shepherd would act so deliberately could feel that his stillness was not confusion, but certainty. A nurse whispered to another staff member that the dog had likely been trained in military operations, but her voice trailed off when Rex suddenly shifted his head toward the corridor again, locking onto the same man in scrubs who had now paused near a supply cart, pretending to check inventory while subtly observing the situation unfolding near Ethan. Ethan followed the direction of Rex's gaze, and for the first time since arriving, his expression tightened not from physical discomfort, but from something deeper, something that felt like a memory pressing against a locked door in his mind, refusing to stay buried. The man in scrubs adjusted his posture slightly, glancing at a digital tablet, but the timing felt unnatural, as if he were waiting for something rather than responding to hospital urgency, and Rex responded instantly, by stepping forward half a pace, placing himself even more firmly between Ethan and that direction, his body language precise and controlled, not chaotic but purposeful. A junior physician attempted to gently guide Rex aside, speaking calmly and reassuringly, but the dog did not acknowledge the voice, instead maintaining focus on the corridor as though the rest of the room had faded into background noise. Ethan slowly exhaled, his hand tightening briefly on the duffel bag before loosening again, and he muttered under his breath that Rex had always been sensitive, but never like this, never this precise, and that thought unsettled him more than he expected. In the reflection of a nearby glass panel, Ethan caught a brief glimpse of the man in scrubs moving again, this time toward a different section of the emergency room, yet Rex tracked the movement without hesitation, adjusting his stance with the same discipline seen in trained field units, as if confirming patterns only he could detect. A faint memory surfaced in Ethan's mind, not fully formed, but enough to make his chest tighten slightly, an image of a secured facility, coded access points, and conversations that were never meant to be remembered outside classified environments, though he forced himself to stay present in the room rather than fall into the past. The atmosphere in the emergency room had become strangely divided. One side focused on medical urgency, the other drawn into the silent standoff created by a single dog refusing to yield. And even the staff who tried to maintain routine procedures found themselves glancing repeatedly toward the corridor without understanding why. The man in scrubs finally stopped near a side exit door, placing his hand briefly on the handle before pausing. And in that moment Rex's entire posture changed, becoming even more rigid, as if anticipating a decision that had not yet been made but was already understood. Ethan noticed this change immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as the fragments of memory inside him began to align, suggesting that what he was witnessing was not random hospital behavior, but something connected to a chapter of his life he had never fully closed. And in the growing silence between breaths and footsteps, it became clear that the truth was not approaching slowly anymore. It was already inside the room, waiting for the right moment to be seen. The emergency room had fallen into a strange kind of suspended silence, the kind that happens when everyone is waiting for something they cannot name. While Ethan Miller remained seated against the wall, his body finally still, but his mind no longer resting, as fragments of memory continued to surface in uneven flashes that he could not fully control. Rex stood in the exact same position, his attention fixed on the side exit door where the man in scrubs had paused moments earlier. And that stillness from the dog carried more weight than any sound in the room, because it suggested absolute certainty without a single word being spoken. A nurse quietly adjusted an four-cart nearby, but even her movements felt slower now, as if the entire environment had unconsciously synchronized itself with the tension Rex was projecting. Ethan's eyes followed the same direction again, and this time the memory that surfaced was clearer, though still incomplete, an image of a secure briefing room, voices speaking in low tones, and a name he could not fully retrieve, but recognized deeply enough to make his chest tighten. The man in scrubs finally moved his hand from the exit door handle and turned slightly, as if reconsidering his path, and in that exact moment Rex took one step forward, not aggressive, not chaotic, but deliberate and controlled, positioning himself so precisely that it was impossible to ignore his intent. A senior physician approached Ethan cautiously, asking if the dog could be restrained or guided away. But the question never reached resolution because Rex emitted a low, steady sound that made the doctor stop mid-step, reconsidering the situation with visible uncertainty. Ethan raised his head slightly, his voice weak but focused as he told them not to approach the dog, because Rex was never wrong about people, though he did not yet understand why he said those words with such conviction. The man in scrubs now fully turned back toward the main corridor, holding the tablet closer to his chest, and walked at a measured pace that appeared calm on the surface but carried an unnatural precision, as if each step had been calculated in advance. Rex tracked every movement without hesitation, adjusting his stance in perfect alignment, blocking any visual path between Ethan and the corridor, and that single action shifted the entire emotional weight of the room, because it no longer felt like a hospital observation, but a controlled standoff guided by instinct that no one else could interpret. Ethan's breathing grew slightly heavier, not from pain alone, but from recognition building slowly inside him, and suddenly another memory surfaced, stronger than the previous ones, involving a mission debrief where something had gone wrong without explanation, followed by silence that was never officially recorded. The man in scrubs paused again near a secondary corridor junction, glancing briefly toward a staff exit sign, and Rex responded instantly by stepping forward another half pace, his focus narrowing even further, as if confirming a decision that had already been made long before anyone else understood the situation. A nurse stepped back instinctively, feeling the intensity without understanding it, while Ethan's grip on the duffel bag tightened once more, as if the physical object anchored him to reality, while his mind tried to piece together fragmented truths. The monitors in the room continued their steady rhythm, unchanged and indifferent, yet everything else felt increasingly unstable, as though the emergency room itself was becoming a space where past and present were beginning to overlap. The man in scrubs finally stopped moving altogether, standing near the corridor intersection, and for a long moment no one spoke, no one acted, because Rex had already made it clear that something beyond routine medical care was unfolding, and Ethan, watching through tired eyes, began to understand that whatever was happening was not about a hospital at all, but about something that had been waiting quietly in the background of his life, now stepping forward into the present without warning. The tension inside the emergency room had become almost tangible, as if the air itself had thickened around every movement and every breath. While Ethan Miller remained seated against the wall, his posture slowly shifting from physical exhaustion into quiet alertness as fragments of memory continued to assemble in ways he could not fully control. Rex stood unwavering near the corridor junction, his body angled in a way that blocked both sight lines and movement, and that precise positioning made it clear that his behavior was not random instinct, but a structured response shaped by experience far beyond what anyone in the room could easily understand. The man in scrubs had stopped completely now, holding the tablet at chest level, his presence oddly disconnected from the urgency of the emergency room, as if he were waiting for a signal rather than participating in a hospital routine. A nurse moved cautiously behind a workstation, exchanging uncertain glances with a colleague, both of them clearly aware that something about the situation had shifted away from standard medical protocol, though none of them could explain why. Ethan slowly raised his head, his eyes narrowing slightly as another memory surfaced, sharper than before, this time involving a sealed file, restricted access clearance, and a conversation that ended with a warning rather than answers, though the details still refused to fully align. Rex suddenly adjusted his stance again, stepping forward with quiet precision, and that movement caused an immediate ripple of discomfort among the staff, because it was no longer just a dog reacting to stimuli, but an entity behaving with intention that seemed almost calculated. The man in scrubs took one slow step backward, then paused, as if reconsidering the timing of his next action, and in that moment Rex emitted a low, steady breath-like sound that froze the nearest staff member mid-motion. Ethan's grip on the duffel bag loosened slightly, and he whispered under his breath that Rex had always been sensitive to people, but what he was seeing now went far beyond simple training or familiarity. It felt like recognition anchored in something deeper and more dangerous than coincidence. The monitors in the room continued their steady rhythm, yet the contrast between their mechanical stability and the human uncertainty around them made the entire environment feel increasingly detached from normal expectations. The man in scrubs shifted his weight again, turning slightly toward the side corridor, and Rex immediately mirrored the movement by stepping into a firmer blocking position, ensuring that no path remained open without his acknowledgement. Ethan watched closely now, his breathing slowing as focus replaced confusion, and another fragment of memory surfaced, this time clearer, involving a covert extraction scenario where trust had been compromised without warning, though the identities involved had never been officially confirmed. A senior physician attempted once more to regain control of the situation by instructing staff to continue standard procedures, but even his voice lacked conviction as his attention kept drifting toward the dog who refused to break focus. Rex's gaze remained locked on the man in scrubs, unwavering and absolute, and the stillness that followed felt heavier than any movement that had come before it. Ethan slowly straightened his posture against the wall, his expression tightening as the fragments of memory began to form a connection he had avoided for a long time, suggesting that the present moment was not isolated, but tied directly to something unresolved from his past service. The man in scrubs finally stopped moving entirely near the intersection of two corridors, holding position in a way that suggested hesitation masked as routine, and Rex responded instantly by narrowing his stance, as if confirming that no further movement would be allowed without consequence. The emergency room, once defined by clinical order and predictable structure, now felt suspended between two realities, one governed by medical procedure and the other by something unspoken but undeniably present, and Ethan, watching through exhausted eyes, began to understand that Rex was not reacting to the hospital at all, but to a truth that had finally caught up with them both after remaining hidden for far too long. The emergency room felt even quieter now, not because the activity had stopped, but because every movement had become carefully restrained, as if the entire staff had unconsciously agreed to respect a tension they could not explain, while Ethan Miller remained seated against the wall with his head slightly raised, eyes no longer drifting, but fully focused on the corridor where Rex stood like a living boundary between truth and uncertainty. The man in scrubs had not moved for several seconds, his posture still angled toward the junction of hallways, holding the tablet in a way that appeared routine on the surface, yet felt disconnected from the urgency of the room. And that disconnect only deepened the sense that his presence did not fully belong to the environment he was standing in. Rex shifted his weight subtly, not breaking his stance, but refining it, adjusting by inches as if responding to changes in pressure that no one else could sense. And that small movement was enough to make the nearest nurse step back from the workstation without realizing she had done so. Ethan's breathing slowed further, and for the first time since arriving, he was no longer fighting confusion but allowing recognition to form, even if it came in fragments that did not yet connect into a complete picture. A technician quietly mentioned that the imaging results for Ethan's initial scan had just finished processing, and the words carried through the room like a distant echo, drawing attention for a brief moment before being overshadowed again by Rex's unwavering focus. A second doctor approached cautiously, holding a digital report, and hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether introducing new information would stabilize or further disrupt the situation. But he eventually stated that there was an unusual foreign object detected within Ethan's system, something not consistent with any standard medical or battlefield injury pattern they typically encountered. Ethan did not respond immediately, but his expression tightened, and a deeper memory surfaced, one that involved secure transport protocols and controlled environments where medical evaluations were performed under strict oversight rather than emergency conditions, though he still could not fully place why this detail mattered now. The man in scrubs shifted slightly at the mention of the scan, and that subtle reaction was enough for Rex to immediately adjust his stance again. Reinforcing his position between Ethan and the corridor, his body language signaling a level of certainty that no verbal instruction in the room could override. A nurse attempted to maintain procedural order by suggesting they move Ethan to a stabilization bed, but even as she spoke, her voice lost momentum, as if the presence of the dog had already redefined what safe movement meant in this context. Ethan slowly lifted his head more fully, and his eyes followed Rex's line of focus again, locking onto the man in scrubs. And in that moment, another fragment surfaced, stronger than before, involving a failed extraction scenario where a secondary identification protocol had been used to conceal a participant's role, though the details still resisted full clarity. The man in scrubs finally took a step backward toward the corridor exit, subtle but intentional, and Rex responded instantly, closing the visual gap with a precise shift that made it clear that movement in that direction would not go unnoticed or unchallenged. The atmosphere in the room tightened further, not through aggression, but through anticipation, as if everyone present understood without being told that something critical was approaching its point of resolution, though none of them could define what that resolution would actually be. Ethan's grip on the duffel bag loosened completely now, resting against his leg, and for the first time his posture reflected not exhaustion or confusion, but the quiet realization that Rex was not reacting to randomness or stress, but to a pattern that had followed them into this place from a past that had never been fully closed. The man in scrubs stopped moving again, this time closer to the exit corridor than before, and Rex did not advance, did not retreat, but simply held his position with absolute precision, as if declaring that no further distance would be allowed without acknowledgement. And in that silent standoff, Ethan finally understood that the emergency room was no longer just treating an injury, but standing at the edge of a truth that had been waiting for years to be seen. The emergency room had reached a point where even the smallest sound felt amplified, the distant beeping of monitors, the soft rolling of equipment wheels, and the restrained footsteps of staff all blending into a tense stillness that no one dared to break. While Ethan Miller remained seated against the wall with his shoulders slightly forward, his breathing now steady, but his attention completely locked onto the corridor where Rex stood unmoving like a silent barrier between the known and the unknown. The man in scrubs remained near the exit corridor, his posture unchanged but his stillness no longer comfortable, as if the weight of being observed had altered the way he carried himself, and that subtle shift did not go unnoticed by Rex, who adjusted his stance again by a fraction, maintaining perfect alignment with every possible path the man might attempt to take. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly as another wave of fragmented memory surfaced, this time clearer than before, revealing a controlled environment, dim lighting, and a voice giving instructions about identity verification protocols that had felt routine at the time, but now carried an unsettling relevance. A nurse near the workstation quietly informed a doctor that Ethan's vital readings had stabilized slightly, but the information barely registered in the room because attention had shifted entirely to the corridor tension, where no one was willing to act without first understanding what Rex already seemed to know. The man in scrubs finally moved again, this time taking a step forward rather than back, and the change in direction was immediate enough to cause Rex to shift his weight forward in response, maintaining a precise blocking position that prevented any direct approach toward Ethan. Ethan tightened his jaw, his focus sharpening as he watched the exchange unfold, and another memory surfaced, stronger than the last, involving a mission reassignment where personnel identities had been altered under official authorization, leaving only partial records accessible after the operation concluded. A senior physician attempted to redirect the situation by instructing staff to continue with standard emergency procedures, but his voice lacked certainty, and even as he spoke, his eyes kept returning to Rex, whose behavior had now fully disrupted any sense of normal hospital flow. The man in scrubs paused again, now closer to the exit threshold than before, and for a brief moment, he turned his head slightly, as if listening for something beyond the room, though no sound was audible to anyone else. Rex responded instantly by lowering his stance slightly, not aggressive, but intensely focused, reinforcing his position as though confirming that any further movement would require acknowledgement rather than assumption. Ethan slowly pushed himself more upright against the wall, his hand leaving the duffel bag entirely, and for the first time his expression reflected not confusion, but a forming realization that the presence of this man was not incidental, but connected to something embedded in his past that had never been fully resolved. A nurse whispered that security should be alerted, but the suggestion faded as quickly as it was spoken, because no one was certain whether the situation required intervention or simply observation of something far beyond standard protocol. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, unchanged, indifferent to the tension building inside the room, and that contrast made everything else feel even more unstable, as if the environment itself could no longer decide what reality it was meant to support. The man in scrubs finally stopped moving completely, standing at the edge of the corridor exit, and Rex held his position without blinking, maintaining a perfect line of separation between Ethan and that final boundary. Ethan's breathing slowed further as clarity began to replace uncertainty, and the fragmented memories aligned just enough for him to understand that Rex was not reacting to fear or confusion, but to recognition, and that recognition was pointing directly at a truth he had avoided for years, now standing only a few steps away from being fully revealed inside the sterile silence of the emergency room. The emergency room felt as if time itself had slowed to a careful breath, every monitor beep and distant footsteps stretched into a fragile rhythm that no one dared to interrupt, while Ethan Miller remained seated against the wall with his back slightly straighter now, his exhaustion still present but overtaken by a growing clarity that had begun forming piece by piece since Rex first blocked the corridor. Rex stood at the threshold of the exit corridor without moving, his entire body aligned with absolute precision, as if drawing an invisible line that no one was permitted to cross without consequence, and that unwavering focus created a silence more powerful than any spoken instruction in the room. The man in scrubs remained at the edge of the corridor exit, no longer advancing, no longer retreating, holding a stillness that now felt intentional rather than uncertain, and the contrast between his posture and Rex's absolute certainty made the entire space feel divided into two opposing truths. Ethan slowly lifted his head higher, his eyes narrowing as another memory surfaced, this one sharper and more structured, involving classified clearance verification, coded identifiers, and a briefing room where decisions had been made without full disclosure to everyone present. A nurse quietly mentioned that Ethan's diagnostic report showed inconsistencies that required further review, but her words faded into the background because every eye in the room was now drawn to the silent confrontation at the corridor threshold. Rex shifted his stance slightly forward, not closing distance aggressively, but reinforcing position, as if confirming that the boundary he had established was not negotiable under any circumstance. The man in scrubs adjusted his grip on the tablet again, his movements measured, but now there was a subtle hesitation in the timing, as if the presence of Rex had disrupted a carefully maintained sequence of intent. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand now resting loosely on his knee, and for the first time his voice carried a trace of certainty as he murmured that Rex had always reacted to people differently, but never without reason, never without something real behind it. A senior physician stepped closer to Ethan, attempting to refocus on treatment priorities, but even he paused mid-sentence as Rex's gaze briefly shifted toward him, not threatening, but absolute in its awareness, causing the physician to reconsider his approach without needing further explanation. The man in scrubs took a small step backward toward the corridor exit again, and that movement immediately triggered Rex to adjust his stance, ensuring the visual and physical line between Ethan and the corridor remained fully controlled, as if maintaining a barrier between past and present. Ethan's breathing became more deliberate as fragmented memories aligned further, revealing patterns of operation logs, personnel reassignment records, and mission outcomes that had never been fully clarified after official debriefing sessions. The emergency room staff remained still in their positions, no longer attempting to intervene, because the situation had shifted beyond procedural structure into something that required observation rather than action. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, unchanged, indifferent, marking time in contrast to the human tension that had reached its peak without a single raised voice. The man in scrubs finally stopped completely at the edge of the exit threshold, and for a brief moment the entire room felt suspended, as if waiting for a final acknowledgement that had not yet been spoken. Rex did not move, did not blink away from his focus, holding absolute precision in his stance, as if confirming a truth that no one else could yet fully articulate. Ethan slowly straightened his posture against the wall, his expression no longer uncertain, and in that quiet alignment of memory and perception, he realized that Rex had not been reacting to fear or confusion, but to recognition rooted in a past event that had never truly ended, and that realization settled heavily in the silence of the emergency room, where everything now pointed toward a truth standing just beyond the threshold of being fully revealed. The emergency room had settled into a silence so complete it felt almost unnatural, as if the entire space had been suspended between one breath and the next, while Ethan Miller remained seated against the wall with his posture now fully upright, his eyes no longer clouded with confusion, but sharpened by a realization that had been building through every fragmented memory since Rex first refused to move. Rex stood at the corridor threshold without breaking focus, his body aligned with absolute precision, holding a boundary that no one in the room dared to challenge. And that unwavering stance carried a certainty that replaced all procedural authority with instinctive understanding. The man in scrubs remained frozen at the edge of the exit corridor, his tablet lowered slightly now, his posture no longer matching the controlled rhythm of the hospital environment, and the subtle shift in his stillness suggested that whatever control he had maintained was beginning to fracture under silent observation. Ethan slowly inhaled, and in that moment a final sequence of memories surfaced with clarity, revealing a secured debriefing environment, masked identities, and a mission outcome that had been intentionally obscured in official records, leaving gaps that were never meant to be revisited outside classified review. A nurse quietly attempted to announce that Ethan's condition required relocation for continued monitoring, but her voice faded as Rex shifted his stance once more, reinforcing the invisible line between Ethan and the corridor with absolute certainty. The man in scrubs took one slow step backward, and that movement was enough to trigger Rex to adjust immediately, maintaining perfect alignment, ensuring that no passage forward or backward could occur without acknowledgement. Ethan's expression tightened as recognition finally settled fully into place, and he slowly turned his head toward Rex, realizing not just what the dog was reacting to, but why that reaction carried the weight of certainty rather than instinct. A senior physician stepped forward again, attempting to regain structure in the situation by speaking calmly about medical procedure. But even his authority felt diminished, as if the room itself no longer recognized hierarchy in the presence of something far more precise and focused. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, unchanged and indifferent, marking time that no longer reflected the tension filling the space, and that contrast made every human presence feel suspended. Between certainty and uncertainty, the man in scrubs finally shifted again toward the exit threshold, and this time Rex did not move forward or backward, but held an unbroken stance that defined the boundary with absolute clarity, as if declaring that the truth had already been identified and could no longer be avoided. Ethan slowly pushed himself fully upright from the wall, his exhaustion no longer defining his posture, replaced instead by a controlled awareness that mirrored the discipline of his past training, and his voice finally emerged steady as he said nothing directly to the room, but understood everything unfolding before him. The man in scrubs remained still at the edge of the exit corridor, no longer attempting movement, and the silence between all parties felt final in a way that suggested resolution was no longer approaching but already present. Rex maintained his position without hesitation, his gaze unwavering, confirming without words what no one else had been able to articulate. And in that moment, Ethan understood that everything leading to this point had been guided by recognition rather than chance, and that the truth he had buried beneath years of distance had finally reached him again through the only witness who had never forgotten.